we are going to start. Thank you so much, everyone for joining in. So this event is hosted by New York Writers Coalition's Black Writers Program. We launched the program with a pilot a few years ago, and we're so excited about all the incredible work we've been able to do since then. Our programming is 99% exclusive for Black writers and artists. But we're starting to do some events where we open it up to everyone because there are incredible authors right there who we want to also be in conversation with some of the authors and writers that we admire. I'm gonna pop this link here into the chat so you can all follow along. And so we are presenting tonight, Forgive Me Not, Jennifer Baker in conversation with Caits Meissner. You can see them and say hi. If you haven't done a Zoom webinar ever or in a while, the way it's gonna work is that it will just be Caits and Jennifer on the screen. I'm gonna start pressing record in a little bit, and I'll let you know if the recording is available at a later date. If you wanna chat, ask questions, react to anything you're hearing. We want the chat to feel like a living space, not just sort of a box that's on your computer screen. So feel free to put your reactions to things you're hearing, things that are moving you, things that are making you think, surprising you, things you didn't know in the chat. We also have our Q&A box because there will be a brief Q&A at the end of this event. So if any questions come up for you throughout the conversation, feel free to pop them in there. It'll be easier to find them in the Q&A box than if you put them in the chat, if the chat gets really live. But that is an option as well. So I am going to click this, and here we are. So I'm going to start by reading Jenn's bio. Jennifer Baker, who is our featured authoress tonight, is a publishing professional of 20 years, the creator/host of the Minorities in Publishing podcast, and a faculty member of the MFA program in the creative nonfiction at Bay Path University and a writing consultant at Baruch College. Formerly a contributing editor to Electric Literature, she received a 2017 NYSCA-NYFA Fellowship and a Queen's Council on the Arts New Work Grant for nonfiction literature. Her essay, What We Aren't, or The Ongoing Divide, was listed as a notable essay in the Best American Essays 2018. In 2019, she was named Publishers Weekly Superstar for her contributions to inclusion and representation in publishing. Jennifer is also the editor of the all-POC short story anthology, Everyday People, The Color of Life, which came out with Atria Books 2018. The cover is gorgeous. And the author of the YA novel, Forgive Me Not, which we're here to discuss tonight, which came out through Nancy Paulson Books this year. She has volunteered with organizations such as We Need Diverse Books and I2 Arts Collective, and spoken widely on topics of inclusion, the craft of writing/editing, podcasting, and the inner workings of the publishing industry. Her fiction, nonfiction, and criticism has appeared in various print and online publications, and her website is jenniferbaker.com, also in the chat. Please give it up for Jenn. Jenn has also been just a years-long fantastic supporter of New York Writers Coalition, so we're so grateful to have you here with us tonight. Jenn tonight will be in conversation with Caits Meissner. And if you go back to the New York Writers Coalition link, you can see Caits' bio there. Caits Meissner is a writer and multidisciplinary artist based in New York City. For over a decade, she has collaborated with incarcerated people across the United States as an educator and creative peer. While serving as the former director of prison and justice writing at PEN America, she edited The Sentences That Create Us, Crafting a Writer's Life in Prison, which came out through Haymarket Books in 2021. And you can find the link to that book here. Which this book won the Mellon Foundation funded 75,000 copies to reach incarcerated readers free of charge. Working on this project propelled Caits to take the book's advice and turn attention to telling her own story. Lately, you can find, yes, look at that cover. Amazing. Lately, you can find Caits in the studio working on secret projects. Her most recent publication is an essay about acting as the only non-incarcerated woman in a prison play, included in Simon & Schuster's anthology, Sad Happens, on the transformative power of tears, which was edited by Brandon Stousey and illustrated by Rose Lazar. Thank you so much, Caits. Feel free to show your love to Caits as well. And so I'm going to get out of the way and let these two amazing people talk about this incredible book. And again, if any questions come up for you, feel free to put them in the chat, in the Q&A box. Also, feel free to put anything that is resonating with you in the chat. All right, I'll be listening. Take it over, Caits.
Thank you so much, Judith. Hi, Jen.
Hello.
Hi, attendees. We have a cozy group, which is kind of nice, I always think.
I think so.
I feel like if you pop into the chat, you'll get a little airtime. As Judith said, I'm Caits, and this will be a full of love event because, Jen, I got to fill them in a little bit on our context. When I got an email saying, would you like to be in this conversation? I was like, would I? I've been for 15 years. We met at a writers' conference in Ghana.
Yeah.
Back in 2008. So this is a really full circle moment to get to come around and talk about this beautiful book, you know, especially coming out of this trajectory of a career I was in. So yeah, here we are. I want to jump right in, Jen. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, please do.
All right. So I want to read the inside cover of your book. I understand it was on the internet, but I want to make sure that the participants really understand the context of the story, because we're going to go all into craft and ideas and how things happened. And so I thought I would ground us, just let you know, if you haven't read the book, what is it about? Right. So it says,
that's helpful.
Yeah. All it takes is one night and one bad decision for 15-year-old Violetta Chen Samuel's life to change forever. After driving drunk and causing the accident that kills her little sister, Violetta is incarcerated. Under the juvenile justice system in this near future world, her fate lies in the hands of those she's wronged, her family. With their forgiveness, she could go home, start again. It's Violetta's big brother, Vince, who delivers the crushing news. Her family does not forgive her, leaving Violetta to make a hard choice: remain in a juvenile detention center for an uncertain time, or face the trials, grueling tests of strength and character designed to rehabilitate and prove her remorse. For the chance to regain her freedom and what she wants most of all, her family's love, Violetta agrees to participate in the trials. But Vince is facing his own trial. He feels like what happened is all his fault and he let his family down. He should have been home the night Violetta took the wheel. Besieged by the pressures of always being expected to do the right thing, Vince begins a dangerous spiral into addiction. As Violetta and Vince's parents realize they have not one, but two children in trouble, this family must decide what it means to forgive not only one another, but themselves. A searing exploration of penance, punishment, and mercy, told from the alternating voices of a brother and sister, Forgive Me Not is a stunning portrait of a family torn apart by the weight of their loss and collective mistakes as they try to reconnect in the face of tragedy. So, I get chills just reading the description because I got so connected to the characters, Jen, reading this book. Before I go into my own take on it, which I am going to talk throughout the night about things that I was really moved by and things that struck me as really accurate from my own background in this work, I want to just start with the genesis of this book. What generated the idea to do this? What brought you into the leap of this conversational topic? And I'm also interested in conversational topic into this issue in our world, but through the lens of a story. And I'm curious if you knew it was going to be a young adult book when you started or not.
Yeah, that's super helpful, because the characters, and it's great to talk to you about it as also artists, is sometimes the characters come first, right? Like the voices, because this is first person, that was very prominent. And so who Violetta and Vincent were and how they sounded came through very clearly. And so it was always looking at teens specifically because they fully formed. And then I thought I could do the adult side, but then it comes that point where you're doing too much, right? And it's like a book is a book. And you can do but so much, whether readers or reviewers say, well, I wish you could have, but it's like, let me respect the contained space of what a book can be, and that it cannot necessarily be all the things. And that to distract from them causes other things, or maybe under a differently skilled person that could have been a bigger story. But I knew I wanted to look at the agency or lack of agency given to teens in this situation because of a decision that was made by adults, because of a decision that is made by folks who are not necessarily experiencing it, which is something we experience all the time, right? Like, who suddenly said that libraries need to be cut? Like, who? And it's just like, who said that we don't need these resources? Who said that suddenly, because you're looking at a spreadsheet or you're looking at this just needs to happen, that the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate decision making that is happening is not necessarily always tied to an understanding. It might be tied to just an action that needs to happen in someone's eyes. And so the story itself was this show called Forgive or Forget. I don't know. I always feel like I'm dating myself when I say that show, because some people know it. Very few people seem to know it. Yes, few people seem to know it. But if you are of a particular age,
I think we might be of a particular age together, but was it cable? Because I didn't have cable. That might be why.
It was syndicated. It was like 11/9, like 11, channel 9 for New York folks. And so it was this show where it was hosted by Mother Love originally. And then the show changed. It pivoted really differently halfway through, right? Janine runs this show. So Mother Love hosted it, and it was kind of like a Jerry Springer stage. It really had that vibe where someone did something wrong, where it's like, I cheated, I got this person into debt, I did, just like terrible things, terrible human, but not great things. And so they went on national TV and told everybody about it, told a live audience about it. And the host would be like, all right, so go to that door. And you would go to the door. And if the person was behind the door, then they were open to having a conversation. Maybe they're thinking they might forgive you. But if they didn't, a video appeared on a screen. Wow. And the person would be like, you're trash. No, I'm not. Why would I fly all the way out there? Da, 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 da. Which is understandable. Again, live audience, national TV. Everyone's telling your business. And that was the show. Yeah, it didn't last too long.
Yeah, I think people might have been like, I'm not going to put myself on blast.
No, then it kind of devolved, if that even, like, it wasn't a great premise in the first place. It just changed, happened. And then Robin Givens started hosting it. It was very interesting. But that's where I was sitting on the couch watching TV. And I was just like, well, what if this is how it worked? What if this is how criminal justice worked? Is that there was this decision-making process, but it was the person who immediately is affected is the one who's making that decision, right? And so then that unravels because you have to get to logistics and you have to learn more about the system and da-da-da-da-da. And there's a responsibility because for me, again, character came first. Like, the idea was prominent, but character came first. And you have to learn, because even within my family, there have been people who have been arrested, and those who have been incarcerated are ones that people detached from. They were usually partners. And then those in my family, particularly men, some women, were usually arrested, charged, dealing with addiction. Addiction runs in both sides, maternal and paternal sides of my family. So I don't look at it as something that's just like, get over it. Having also worked with people at a very young age who had, dealt with addiction and stuff like that. There's this really bad connotation under it, this assumption of like addiction is something you should just like, it affects you forever. It can follow you forever. So like recognizing that and then learning more about systems and then understanding how this world looks similar to our world, but it isn't our world, but it's similar. So it's like you're having that conversation where you need to make stuff up and allow it to be made up, and also make sure that you're doing diligence to the representation. And for me, because some folks did ask, they were like, oh, did you go into centers? And I was like, no, because I was still getting my education as a person, but also as a teacher. And I did not feel good about going into a space simply to get content, especially
You're
criminal
walking right into my next question. Let me
justice.
ask it.
Okay.
It seems like I did something to prepare. So I before you go into your research, I wanted to ask about research because
Yeah.
I found the details to be excruciatingly accurate at times. And the way I
Oh,
described it in
thank
my
you.
Instagram post was Family Saga meets a Black Mirror episode, because
Yeah.
it feels
You need to be writing copy. Like we need to be paying you a lot of money to write copy.
pay me a lot of money. Shall
Mhm.
take it.
Mhm.
But really that edge between what is and what could be, it sits right there in this book. And so just a couple details to pull out. The mention of a teen girl killed her baby so her parents wouldn't find out. It's a brief mention, but it socked me in the gut because I taught somebody at Rikers Island, a young woman who did that or did something similar to that, right? To the food and how grubby and nasty it is in prison. And I'm saying prison because even though it's juvenile detention looks just like adult prison. It's just with kids.
Right.
And I have been in those centers because I did used to teach in that context, many years ago. The way that incarcerated people are treated and young people are treated was profound, I thought, in this book. What the visiting room looked like and the rules in the visiting room and the vending machines and how people are really treated like their number, identified by their number. They're not called by name or by their last name. So all these details really struck me as having been in over, I think, something like 30 prisons across the United States and youth prisons. It was like, this feels real. That Jenn got the context, really got the context. And I'm curious what your research process was like if you weren't actually going into those spaces and worried about exploitation, which I appreciate and understand. How did you find all this out? How did you get those sensory and contextual details?
It was the readers. So it was me imagining, like I watched a lot of documentaries. We had Scared Straight for a bit, MTV folks. Scared Straight. Like there's so many, and why do few people think that was a good idea? Yeah, what you watched is entertainment. And then you're like, wow, that was really jacked up. So watching that, getting readers, one was in the Writing for Justice program, who
Really?
I was connected to. Yeah. And
Are you
she's
able to share?
Vivian.
Oh, fantastic.
Vivian.
Vivian Nixon. Look her up.
Yeah. And she consults for a lot of things. So she was very, very kind to have a read and then have a very long conversation with me. I spoke to another friend whose sister worked at Rikers, reading books, reading a lot of the Haymarket books, Mitch Jackson, talking a little bit to Mitch about and hearing more about how he talked about when he was formerly incarcerated, because a lot of his work points to that, being in conversation with people, but not sitting there and being like, can you tell me what this was like for you? Like actually listening because their work did, Reggie, Randall, so many people do talk about it. So that research of immense looking at TV, but really looking at documentary more, and how in that case, those who were incarcerated were given the voice more rather than, the dramatization. And so I had to turn from that and as I'm reading abolition books and Kianga and, a lot of Angela Davis's work, especially her edited collection, which is over there, where you see it's a series of letters between her and Black Panthers and other people who were incarcerated in the 70s and stuff like that. So really tackling the emotion and wanting to get the logistics and talking to people about it, because I just didn't, I'm not saying it's not a responsibility, but it's not an easy thing to just go into a place of detention.
No, it's not.
It's not a thing. It's not like you call some people up and, to be like, oh, so can I just visit? Can I just visit your school? Can I just visit your office? Can I just visit your hospital? Those are easier to do and may feel a little bit less exploitive, but it really felt exploitive if I was just and now I'm mining this. And so I fought with that for a bit, but then I was like, no, there's other ways for me to do this. And if I'm doing it well, the emotions will come through and the logistics need to be carried with that.
Well, you did it well.
Oh,
I
thank you.
will tell you. Because I have been in those spaces many, many
Yeah.
times and taught many young people, and I was really struck by that. All right, so I want to go back to Vin and Letta. All right, that's their nicknames in the book,
I
right?
know, I love them.
And it's just so fun to hear them being talked like about by real people, like as if they're real people. It must feel so good after them being
Yeah, it's like
so long.
I mean, you've written a couple books too, so you know where you're just like, okay, that's done.
Yeah, I do. You're like, I'm on to
like
the
they're
next.
out of my head. Like, bye. Love you.
And now
Bye.
they're in my heart. So I
Yeah.
want to talk about them and how you constructed them. So, you know, you said in the notes of your book, you just said now that they came to you first. They came to you pretty well formed, their voices.
Mhm.
But I want to know, you know, from a writer's perspective, I'm always curious, and I have a lot of questions about sort of how you shaped this. I'm really curious how you nurtured them as the author. How did you live with them? How did you bring them to life? What kind of questions were you asking yourself around how to bring their characterization out? They're both
Right.
very clear, lovable, real,
Oh, thank you.
sweet, complex characters.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I knew that I wanted to come from a place of love. And I think the parents were the hardest, really. So, like Viv and like with Viv, their sister, and then them, it's a young adult book. They need to be central to the story. You know, it's about them. Like, it's the adults, what the adults are doing is affecting them, but it is about them. So I came with a lot of concern and empathy for what they were both going through. And I think even at age 30 something going through 40, you don't forget what it's like to feel minimized. You don't forget what it's like to feel insecure because it doesn't go away. I told a group of teens this a couple weeks ago. I said, just FYI, whatever like feeling, they don't go like you don't suddenly become 30 and you're just like fully formed human being who has a great sense of self.
I've
And
got this.
right, like you're not totally emotionally evolved as a human. Like you may not be able to communicate well, you may not, and I'm like, I'm telling you,
Sorry, teens.
like this is real. So I don't see this huge, I do and don't see this huge kind of expanse where you can't relate to someone at that age who's going through what they're going through. And it's a very extreme case, but it's also like sometimes young people are made to grow up too fast. And so all those elements of like what they were going through, I just really related to them as people. Like I get it. I get what it is like to be compared to an elder. I don't have siblings, but I had an older cousin I lived with, and it was like, well, he's an honor roll, he's in this, and da da da. You know, and you know what it's like to be have people say these little digging things and not realize that those dig at you, especially as someone who's been in therapy for even longer. So I came at it a lot from the psychology of like how these little things build up and recognizing how they can lead to that. And then it becomes that issue of like, well, how do you structure that in story? Because you can know it, but then you have to actually present it.
Absolutely. And I think you also really nailed the big sibling syndrome. I am a big sibling. And I was like, oh, the pressure of being the firstborn is very real. Look,
Right.
very real. And I want to ask more about, well, first I was thinking, would you be open to reading a little bit of Violetta's voice and a little bit of Vin's voice so that our
Sure.
folks here can hear who they are?
Oh yeah, sure. Do you have requests?
I didn't come with me. This isn't off the top of my head. But oh, there's so many moments. I'm like, let me see a place where I went, oh my God, and wrote in it. Oh, see, I wrote pressure and firstborn.
Yeah. Because for Vince, I could do chapter a little bit
I'm
of
gonna give you
chapter
free reign
4.
because you know the book
Okay.
so well.
Okay, let me do a little bit of Vince on chapter 4. Vince, days since the decision, since you see there's a countdown of sorts in this book. I'm on my 3rd bag of red licorice. This is becoming a problem. Whenever I move, the wrappers near the gas and brake pedals remind me of my gorge fest. After Letta's sentencing this morning, I decided I need time alone and some serious sugar. Outside the 24/7 mart, the smell of gas is heavy. The mart is a glass cube with neon lights advertising dollar deals and low, for this part of the city, gas prices. You can see the orange and green awning from any nearby roadway, especially once it gets dark. I'm on an afternoon sugar high that I hope settles enough for me to sleep. And the mart parking lot is a nice place to be alone, though. Just me, some strawberry twists, and the slight thrum of the car's heater to combat the winds outside. Hopefully, these weeks will be the last of the chill as we head into spring. And the next paragraph is really long, so I'm not going to.
But we get a sense his, Twizzler
Yeah.
addiction, which
Yeah, he's big into sugar, especially
evolves.
since he's coming off of one thing, so he's going on to sugar. And here's Violetta chapter 5 for her. Days in detention, 23. The day after sentencing, I get a crash course in the trials, the beginning, the triumphs, the expected outcomes. Me, Serena, and another girl newly sentenced to trials listen to my counselor give us the rundown. We're in this room used for mandatory schooling during the week. Counselor Susan stands at the front. A whiteboard is behind her with a projection of her presentation. What you need to know about the trials. My eyes dart from the board to the notebook Counselor Susan gifted me at our first meeting. We're not allowed to bring the study books to ourselves. This offering from Counselor Susan is the only extra thing I have since I haven't received commissary funds. Petra gave me a couple of her colored golf pencils, one blue and one red. Combined, they make purple, my favorite color. This helped me color code my thoughts, including what my counselor will say about the trials. I was always good at taking notes in school, only this time it's my life, not a quiz. I want to make sure I remember everything she tells us. Apparently, I'm the only one writing all this down. The girl sitting up front and Serena stare ahead, waiting for this to be over. Yeah.
I think those are great passages to also share a little bit about their character and what they're grappling with. Violet is like this good student,
Right.
she's like, let me take notes on this. And the other girls are like, what?
Mhm.
Like we're zoning
We're
out.
done.
This is bullshit. Why are we even here? And I think kind of, I think what's so powerful about this context as well is it's sort of ostensibly this like great family, whatever that means. But this family that's connected and supportive, and the parents are struggling, but they're trying, they make some decisions that you question, but they probably never imagined themselves in this position, and then boom, one night changes everything, and there's this, struggle happening around, or struggle that was under the surface, as young people have struggles and their parents aren't always aware of them. So I'm curious, how did you think about, like, process-wise, did you do character descriptions? I remember Sergio de la Pava, the author, saying to me, I said, how do you write? He runs the DA office in Manhattan, and he writes these huge novels. And I'm like, how do you write those huge novels? And he's like, well, I think about the book as my friend. And whenever I'm like in line at the post office, I'm like, oh, I get to hang out with my friend, which I loved. So I'm always curious, and I'm working on finishing right now an illustrated novel, also about a teenager. So it was great to read this. And I was thinking, I was wondering how you lived with the characters and how you brought them to life, how you decided. Was it really organic? Were you just typing? Did you think, oh, I want to characterize, Vin is gay, which we find out like kind of into the book a little bit, which I really, or at least queer, which I appreciate. And it's very, there's no fanfare around it. It's just his life. How did you make the decisions? It's an intermixed family. It's Chinese and Black. How did you make these how did you shape these characters?
They shape themselves in a way. And it's funny because, I get it, because when I was in my MFA and all that, they're like, do character sketches. And I do think those work. I do think folks should, if you really don't know your characters, figure them out. But for me, it is kind of like, it's not quite a possession, it's a zone. So when they come, you're in the supermarket, you're on the subway, you're brushing your teeth, you are cooking, you are in the midst of a Zoom even, and you're like, oh, that'd be great. Right? You just like write it down, like that scene makes sense, or that that quote sounds so much like so-and-so, or that moment so much. And so when I go to the page, because it can be, okay, I'm spending an hour a day writing for a month, or I'm doing 1,000 words like Jamie Attenberg does, right? Or you need to make a deadline or something like that. And they're coming and they're so real and fleshed out that I just knew who they were. They were this. Like if someone came up to me and said, Vince dates women, I would be like, no. No, I'm like, he doesn't. I was like, from the get-go, he was always having an issue with a boy. And that was how he came. It was like, and Vince has a guy who broke his heart. So like the first,
it does.
right, like the first 4 chapters and the last chapter didn't change. Like they got refined and they got tighter, but those chapters did not change, right?
Did you write back to front? I have so many.
No, front and then the ending, and then went back to the beginning, and then had to top all that. I jump around. I'm not like with short stories, I work beginning to end, but with novels, it's boom, 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 boom. It's all over the place. So this book was
same
really
here, but I'm just encouraged to hear it.
Yeah. Sometimes that's just how it is. So for them, because I'm born and raised New York, I'm from Queens, like I can't relate to a book where it's not intersectional, where there's not that level of like you were constantly around your communities. Like there were all these books, and I understand them, and I don't think I'm equipped to write those books where it's like you're the only one. You know, you're the only Black person, you're the only queer person, you're the only blah 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 in your group. And I'm like, I don't know what that's like. I really don't. I don't know what it's like to be the only one. Like it wasn't until I went into the formal workspace and corporate spaces, and I was like, oh, but I'm not bringing that, oh, must operate for the, you know, whatever of establishment. It was just like, no, I'm used to, I go outside, they're Black people. I go outside, they're this. I go outside. Yeah. So I'm like, I don't understand. Like being
Queens
the
is
only one.
super present in this book too. It's its own character, and I know you live in Queens, so as I'm reading it, I was like, "Oh, Jen's bringing some." I feel like this might be me making those noises. If you can hear them, it's driving me crazy. Let me quit this. I don't know how to get iMessage off my computer, but it seems to want to.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. Sometimes you're just like, boop, and it's like, hey,
drives me crazy. I didn't put it on. But there's so much, you know, Queens is so present in this book. Oh, you don't hear it. Good. It was just making me crazy. It's ding, ding, ding. And Queens is, I think that, is it? I don't want to be wrong in this stat, but is it the most diverse?
Are diverse, yeah.
It's the most diverse borough, but I think it's the most diverse part of the United States. Yeah. I think it has the most cross-cultural intersections or something like this. I might be a little off in that stat, but it's close if not. And having, you know, also being a New Yorker and going to Queens and seeing, I was like, oh, Queens is so alive in this book. And it creates, it's interesting because it almost creates this, I don't want to say utopia, that's the wrong word, but it creates this like secondary space that's sort of a intention with the detention center. You have this, you know, really isolating, awful, no agency place next to this, you know, culturally rich, diverse, and, you know, full of tradition, as is in the book. They have a tradition, for example, of going to visit their grandparents' graves that comes up a few times in the book, and through a cultural festival. So with that said, I'm always curious, selfishly, how much of yourself did you put in these characters? Or would you say they're totally separate from you?
I relate to both of them. Like the voice of Vin sounds a little bit more like me, a bit more sarcastic, especially the way I hear him in my head. And the audiobook folks, they did amazing jobs. And at the same time, it's still not quite what is in your head. So you're grateful for their interpretation. And then when people hear me read it, they're like, oh, it's a little different. Oh, okay. But I'm like, but I'm not an actor. So I'm like, give it up for the actors who do audiobooks. So his voice sounds a little bit more like me. Like it's a little snarky. It's more at edge. Like, what did you just say? Like, you know, how he just like combats certain things with sarcasm.
Often.
Yeah. And then Violetta is, I think I relate more to young her because I had that level of obediency. You do what you meant, but what happens if you just didn't, you know? And I was so scared to be disobedient that it was very straight line. I did what I was supposed to do. And I wanted to look at that. And that's also that connection that I think you need with characters. And maybe you've talked about this in workshop too, Caits, is if you are judging a character rather than like being with them, I think that affects the writing. Because sometimes I've been in workshops where I'm like, you don't like this person. Like you writer don't like this person.
The character they're embodying.
Right. And then I'm like,
I've never thought about it that way, but that's why you're kind of opening my brain up in a different way where I'm like, oh, you can tell when an author doesn't love their characters.
Yeah. There's that judgment. And then it's like, well, why should I care? And then I remember one particular workshop, this person was writing about like really a horrible human being, right? Like just racist, a cop, had the most power, just hate, like just was awful to everybody. There was just nothing redeeming, if you can say that, about that character. And even the instructor was like, you were giving this person the most power, you were making this person the worst person, and none of us care about this person. None of us, we can all predict where this is gonna go. So why are you writing
doing for the reader? Yeah, what's it doing for the reader? I think I remember this story. I mean, I think I remember you telling me about this.
In fact. I'm sure I did.
Like, oh, this rings familiar. Well, it's such a lesson too, because I think, and particularly writing for a teen audience, the level of compassion and love that you have for these characters is so poignant. And there are moments in the book where, I was enraged by what Violetta was going through. And when she stood up for herself, I was like, yes. And, and I thought she as a character had so much grace through this, horrific experience and losing family and family to distance and grappling and her own secret process of how she was healing away from, this dodgy counselor who doesn't care about her and two-faced, and this sentencing guy who's like, just, like every bureaucrat rolled up into one. And I think I'm jumping around a little bit because I'm kind of going out of order of my own questions, but I think, and I'm also just talking off the top of my head, I thought a lot reading this book about students that I've taught, not just in juvenile detention at Rikers Island, but also in a prior life. I also was a teaching artist, teaching writing in public schools in the South Bronx, etc. But for a long time in the South Bronx with a particular rotating group with some core members. And I feel like I got to know teenagers very well. And teenagehood was a very, very, very creatively potent time in my own life. It's why I'm writing about that time. But also having been steeped in classrooms with students who were in and out of the system or on the verge of being in the system, these scenes felt so believable to me. The boyfriend who's pressurizing, the older boyfriend, and the good girl going along with it because look, somebody's interested in me, right? I don't want to give it away if you haven't read it, but the scene in the auditorium where there's humiliation involved of this young person's experience, the high school dramas that play out, with the heartbreak, the addictions, the pressure of being a superstar athlete. Like, I know all of these kids is what I felt like. Like, I'm like, I also felt they were very real. I'm like, you could have been in my class. And I think one of the things that really struck me about Violetta's story and came through is that she was in juvenile detention for her own decisions, but she also was heavily influenced by an older boy. And it is statistically the truth that women and young women inside prison or detention of any capacity, like 9 times out of 10 are there out of coercion by a man or covering up for a man. And there's some influence of a man on them. And I think there's something, I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think when we got to the section where the former boyfriend is testifying about how, she was doing all this and this and this and this. And really we know as the reader that he was not a great guy. He was a shady
Mhm.
character. Her older brother hates him. The parents never met him. She's
Mhm.
going along with his desires, not fully.
Mhm.
She stops from
Mhm.
having sex, but because she wants to be liked, right? Which is a very human feeling.
Right.
So I'm curious too about when you're thinking about Letta and her experience where she was pushing her own edges, and then when she stands up, like what was there some catharsis in writing that for you? I mean, as the former like
Yeah.
good girl, or
Right.
how were you thinking about these kind of dynamics between boys and girls? I don't know if it was conscious or not, but it really struck me that I was like, yes, of course, there's a boy involved. And I don't mean that's always the case, but in the way our society
Right.
is structured with masculinity and toxic masculinity and so on, it just
Right.
happens to be that often women go
Mhm.
along with men and
Mhm.
boom, 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 their life unravels.
Yeah, and a lot happens unconsciously. I don't know if that's how it is for you too, but for me, it's
Yes.
just like you write it, and then in the revision process, you're like, oh, it works out.
You're
like,
like,
that
my
makes,
brain is smarter than me.
yeah, it's just like
Yeah.
all this latent stuff, and you're like, okay, that works. Craft wise, I can make it, that brings us full circle. And I thought even more about the misogyny and the misogynoir because of how she and her brother were treated.
Mm.
Like why does
Ooh.
Vin get a pass for so
Yeah.
much? And he's like, you need to hide this better. Well, were you not given the tools to hide this better? Or don't you get the leeway to be able to fulfill this kind of masculine and like all of quote unquote all American space? And that she is kind of riding these coattails with the expectation of what this cis queer male has established. And even in that, like she is in a shadow. She is always in a shadow, and it's very much Jan Brady, which again, dating myself, but it is also like the misogyny and patriarchal nature that we operate on because we're raised that way. And so, of course, we would expect her to. Why wouldn't you do what someone else says? Why wouldn't you do what is expected of you? Why wouldn't Pascal, the guy, the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, not expect her to just because he's used to this? He's used to this.
He looks like a boy band. It's
Yeah,
said at one point. We know he's, yeah, exactly. He's used to
he's
getting
used to
his
it.
way. It's his
And
world.
she's not given the tools. Like there was this really, really necessary post where this guy was like, everyone tells me to warn my daughters about boys, but I should be warning my boys about how they treat women. You know what I mean? Like, and that's how I just saw it because that's how I was raised. And so the arc for Violetta had to be that because she couldn't change anything, right? Like, unfortunately, what happened happened. And if we're looking at it in the context of this happened, and she is not saying it didn't happen, we're not looking at innocence or guilt, right? Which can be a lot of the platform that happens, especially when we see it
Huge.
in film and in wonderful, wonderful books. And at the same time, it becomes like redemption or the system is okay, quote unquote. But in this case, it messed up. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like the system's messed up. And she did it, but where do we go? Where do we go when someone admits it, recognizes it, wants to do better, wants to be better, needs the support to do better, deserves that? Where do we go? And what happens when she is brown? What happens when she is a she? All that stuff. And so that's what she had to have agency by the end. And I did need that to happen from a character standpoint, from a plot standpoint, because what else could I give her? Whether it is actual freedom or not, I'm not going to relay whether that happens, but she had to own something at the end of the day. And people needed to be confronted, and she deserved that.
I think
That
that's
anything she
also,
deserved.
it's very, very real. It's very, very real that somebody, regardless of the system, which I want to talk about also how the system presents in this book, which is, not far off from reality and also like extra terrifying. Like all of it. I was just like, I have notes in the book that are like, oh shit. Certain moments are like, what? Like, no. So there's some also, I think the imaginative thrill in it is still there, even though it's a serious topic, which I think is important also to be bought into this other world. Anyway, my point is, I think watching people who have deeply transformed while being in prison or juvenile detention, I've never really seen somebody deeply transform in juvenile detention, largely because I didn't work with the same students long enough to see a trajectory. I would kind of get them in the middle of their limbo space where Violetta is for much of the book, and what's happening to me next? When's my trial? Am I going to go upstate? Am I going to get released? Am I going to get probation? You know, there's this real purgatory sense of I'm just living in this, you know, prison, and what's next? And all similar questions, I think, to Violetta, even if the victims aren't the family, but the other characters in the book too. Will my family come to see me? Who's showing up? Is anybody showing up? Will I be forgiven? And but seeing adults who've gone through their own, usually long-term trajectory, forgiveness of self is the ultimate, because nobody can really give that to you, right? So I think your instinct was spot on, that she took the self-agency to say, and really her healing comes through an acts she propels on her own that are outside of the mandates. There's no adult really helping her in this book. There are adults, you know, punishing her in this book. There are adults that are confused in this book. But it seems to me the only person who really has her back, aside from another young woman in the facility, and I want to talk about friendship in this book too, is her brother. And he both fucks up and comes back around to be a support. So I think there's a way in which I just really want to give you props for the world that you create, in which young people are figuring themselves out and find out how to step into their own power, you know, through this total stripping of agency. With that said, friendships at that age are so deeply important.
Right, they are.
So deeply important. Talk about the you know, the secondary characters. How did you get them onto the page? How did you decide who they were? Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat, and that's why sometimes I'm losing my train of thought. I'm going to close it off until it's time for Q&A. I'm glad you're stirring the convo. How did you think about friendship in this book? How did you decide who those characters were? And something that I always struggle with in my book is, how much of them do we need for them to make an impression? So how did you kind of deal with that formula, so to speak?
And not wanting them to overshadow the characters so much that they take over the scene, that people are pissed that they don't see them more.
Yeah, because there's some compelling side characters in here. You know?
Yeah. So Callie was always there, like Callie and Levy. So Levy is Vince's love interest, and then Callie is Violetta's best friend.
I love Callie, just for the record. Callie held it down for her friend.
Yeah, because she needed someone from the outside, so to speak, who knew her before. And if she's not talking, and I don't think it's really a spoiler to say she being Violetta, she doesn't get to talk to her family because they are the victims of the crime. So they are encouraged not to talk, as is in real life, right? You're encouraged not, you know, if you're suing somebody, they're like, don't talk to them. Don't
muddy the water.
Yeah, there'll be mediators and intermediaries and all that stuff. So she needs somebody who's like, I remember you from before all this, and I love you, and I relate to this, and I'm here for you, and it's awful, but I am here. And even Callie's mom, who's like, we'll pray for you. You know, like her grandparents are praying for her too, but the way they're coming off to Violetta is like, okay, but you know, Callie says, we're Catholic, girl. We pray for everybody. Don't worry about it. We got you.
I love that moment.
We got you. Don't worry about it. So she was always very clear, and Levy was always. So I think, again, because I was just so focused, that adults were actually the hardest to write, because I was so focused on the teens. So the parents came off more like just angry. Just angry. They were angry. And a good friend of mine, Erica, who also reviewed it, you know, I hired 7 people as sensitivity readers or authenticity readers, or whatever term you want to use, who are of the backgrounds or had the knowledge of all that stuff. And I I paid out of pocket for that. My publisher did not pay for that.
You invested. You
Yeah,
invested
because
in your
it's
book.
important. You don't
It
want
is.
to you don't want to cause harm. I might inadvertently do that, and I want to not do that. You know, like, so if I can be diligent and utilize the advance that I'm given to do so, I'm going to do it. And luckily, because of the community, people were able to do that for me, and I had enough time and space to get that feedback in a real way.
That's great.
And one was that she was just like, yeah, the parents are just coming off awful. They're just coming off really, really awful. And so I needed to amplify that of their pressures, you know, to the point where it's like, I'm cool with people if they're like, I hate the parents. And some people have said that. They're like, no, the parents treated F the parents, hate the parents, hate the parents. And I think I can deal with that now, because I hope I reflected more of their love and concern, but it is coming from such a messed up, chaotic, vulnerable space that you can't think rationally. If someone's like, so your kid killed someone and you need to do something, and the law stipulates this. And imagine if someone's in your face saying you need to make a decision about your and your kid wouldn't be dead if you were better parents, and people judging you, and your money's, you know, you're worried about finances, you're planning a funeral, you're thinking about this is how the law works. You don't know how the law works because you're not paying attention, which is a big thing in society, right?
Oh yeah.
So much of us don't know the intricacies of how, you know, like, I don't know how it works in Maryland. I don't know how it works in Florida. I'm more aware of how it works in New York City, which is not how criminal justice works in every state. It is different.
Correct.
And most people don't even know that, right? So I'm coming at it prioritizing the teens, because this is a book for teens, but also understanding as an adult that they needed care too. Like, Violetta absolutely needs care. Vin absolutely needs care, but they needed someone to just say, don't make this decision right now. Like, don't make any decision, And I think there was all this stuff coming at them, you know, like judgment, and this is what you should do. And, you know, people hounding them for money. And, you know, like, I don't think people realize that. Like, a 15-year-old's not going to think about all of that. Whereas we as adults, once you start dealing with stuff, you're like, that pile of bills I'm ignoring, that I don't want to deal with, that Like, those realities really mess you up and can freeze you up.
Yeah, I really got that. I really got that the parents were looking for direction. You know, they were in
desperate for it.
Profound grief, you know, what an impossible situation. And I definitely didn't hate them. I didn't love their choices, but I also, I think they really came through this, and Vin really points it out. Like, he's like, my parents are just going with this guy from the system as if he has all the answers, and he's this robotic, you know, this is the rules, this is what we have to do. And when you find out what Violetta has to do in order to gain forgiveness, these trials, which I won't give away, even though I want to talk about them, I was like, this is a cruel and unusual punishment. It's horrific.
Right.
And very specifically horrific to the person's experience.
Right.
Although, you know, there's also plenty of deeply humiliating experiences that happen in our current system as well. And this sort of pushes it just a little further, right?
Exactly.
So even just the idea of, you know, the idea of being humiliated in front of your peers, for example, that's anybody on a trial that goes to media, right? So I think what you did so beautifully was expose all of that. And really, for me, here's the big gun question really for me. So I really grapple with the alternative. Throughout time, prison reform has often been presented as better for the people inside, but ultimately it just becomes another system of oppression. You know, Rikers Island was a reformist jail when it started, and now it's considered to be one of the most abusive, you know, hellscapes out there. So, you know, a lot of people, rightfully, including myself, are wary of reformist tactics because they're just going to get warped again, right? And then there's this question of victims' rights, which can sometimes seem to be promoting prison, but the way that I see it often is, you know, what happens to victims? They are cut out of the system, not in this book, but they are in our real life. They're cut out of the
Right.
process. It's the state
Right.
versus the perpetrator. And
Mhm.
where does their healing come in? And I've always, even though I think our system is broken and we really need to figure out a new way, I've always understood the victim perspective. And I think you do
Mhm.
when you or someone you love has been the victim of violent crime. You have feelings that you never thought you'd have before. You're like, wow, this is
Right.
not my political ideology, but emotionally,
Right.
put that motherfucker somewhere far
Mhm.
away, you know, and
Mhm.
that's an honest feeling. And I think, you know, what I really admired about your book is that you're bringing all of this together in a way that I think in the politicized landscape of prison work is hard to have honest conversations about because it's so loaded. And some people really say, let's stay in the lane of intellectual ideology. That's where we have to be because otherwise we're going to be swayed by details. But then there's this, you know,
Mhm.
really human
Mhm.
piece that you know, is some of the oldest questions of humanity. How do we deal with violence? I mean, this scenario
Yes.
is complex in a different way. You know,
Right.
it's not like it's homicide or, you know, it's an accidental death, but it still taps in. So I wondered, all of that said, if you came out of writing this book with more questions or some answers for yourself.
Oh, I definitely think I had more questions because then as I was doing the research over 8 years, mind you, this is 8 years
Wow.
of like from the time I literally began those first paragraphs to the time it literally was done and then we're getting it proofread and all that stuff. 8 years. That's eight
I
years.
believe it. I
Yeah,
believe it.
right. And so you grow, you hopefully you grow in that time. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm an abolitionist. I'm like, because I was just like, and right, like so many abolitionists hate the word reform for the exact reasons you say. And it forced me to think about things in a day. And I don't have answers. You know, I read more about like, oh, what's restorative justice? No, what's really restorative justice? like
Right.
yeah, like there's this new press book about paroling and how parole companies work, or like no, it's bail bondsmen. I think it's bail
Mhm,
bondsmen
mhm,
and stuff like
mhm,
that, which are
mhm.
usually always there's an office near a prison or a jail
One,
or
there's
something.
usually like five, right?
Yeah, for me
Well,
there
in the
used to
city
be
there is.
two when they closed. It's so
Oh,
weird.
really?
I'm near the criminal courthouse in Queens,
Oh,
so
it's
it's
big,
weird.
it's big business.
Yeah, yeah, and he
All of it's
talks
big
about it.
business. Yeah.
And I didn't know any of that because the business of it, the privatization, and actually it was like, yeah, the new Jim Crow, but also like Orange is the New Black that led me to a rabbit hole that like was like,
Mm.
okay, so this is private. Oh, let me look into that. like I like okay, we're talking about that. Like I was looking so much at laws, I was like, oh wait, there's money. There's money to be made here.
Big
And
bucks.
yeah, and so that made me think more about, because people kept asking me about the rule. Well, like how did it start? What are the rules? And you're like, ah, but I had to sit and think about like explain it, and it came from real things. Like Lionel Tate is basically Levon Harrison. That's who he's based off of, a
Mm.
real young boy from Florida.
Well,
Uh,
who is this character for those who haven't read? Because I know who you're talking about, but
yeah, so Levon Harrison is basically who, his case, I should say, was what initiated the trials. And so a young boy, 12 years old, Black, accidentally killed his little cousin in a wrestling accident. This a Lionel Tate, who's 12 in Florida, similar thing. And
Hmm.
he was charged with life in prison. They treated him like adult. They're like, yeah, you know, the evidence shows there were more contusions and it was more violent than and no one's dismissing the fact that something awful happened and it shouldn't have happened, but the fact that this 12-year-old Black kid in Florida, and you know who was governor then? Jeb.
Our favorite.
Jeb Bush was governor then and was like, yep. I like put him, yeah, nope. And so when the
Which,
appeals came,
yeah,
no.
which created a trajectory. I mean, just now in states they're withdrawing juvenile life without parole. People are getting chances to get out. So these are minors sentenced to life in prison. And if you don't
life.
know, life in prison is a death sentence. You might not be killed in an electric chair, but you are never, you don't, it's life without the possibility of parole.
Yeah.
So the systems across different states have started to recognize this, and people are coming home. But, you know, after decades of doing time for something they did as a teenager.
Decades. And it
And
initiates, as like you said, because Lionel went back because he violated parole.
right. So there you go, right? Violating parole could be I smoked a joint, you know, because I was stressed out. I've known plenty of people who've had moments like that, or the sheer terror of if I do something that, you know, other people do without consequence, am I gonna destroy my life again?
Yeah.
I was really amazed by the way you were thinking, Jen, because I would say this is a book that is thinking about abolitionist principles in a different way. So it's looking at what if this was an alternative? And at face value, you're like, oh, the victims are involved. You know, there's a conversation to be had. There's an opportunity for forgiveness. But everything in the apparatus you write is pushing people away from that option.
Mm-hmm.
The words rehabilitation are used all the time throughout this book, which is a buzzword that we know from the you know, prison abolitionist movement or reform movement. Even rehabilitation has become this buzzword where it's untrue.
It's not, they're not rehabilitating anybody.
No, and what happens is that they're like, this arts program is rehabilitative. We do this, it's rehabilitative. It's a gender responsive prison. It's a trauma informed prison. You know, is there such thing? Can there even be such thing? And I think the people that I've met and what I've understood from folks I know is they did not become rehabilitated because of prison. They changed their own lives because of something they encountered inside the prison that opened them up. Mentorship, often a book, very often a book.
Very often books.
Other folks that are incarcerated teaching them spirituality.
Yeah.
It's like what gets put in the path, which doesn't have to happen in prison, but that's where they are, right? So they make a chance to change. And there is some level of, you know, being cut off from the outside world. So here you are in this space. What are you going to do with your time? Is a real question people ask.
Sure.
So I thought was really interesting in this book was this idea of rehabilitation. You're going to be rehabilitated by essentially being traumatized, right? It's very potent in this book, but it is exactly. And there were some mentions also of like the before times, like how the system used to be. There's a scene in the cafeteria where the girls are talking, right? And they're like, well, somebody says, somebody's parent was like, but it wasn't that much better before. It was sort of the same thing. So I kept thinking about all these conversations I've had over the years with people saying, I can't get with reform because it just turns into another form of punishment.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you nailed that.
Oh, thank you. And that's, I feel like, a bigger question that this book does that I think I'm eager for even other books about carceral systems and whatnot to look at. Because again, there's so many books that I admire and teach and work with people about, and that we're looking at the emotional impact, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I love about them, is that like we're looking at the individual. And at the same time, I'm not saying that those books need to do something else, because those books stand on their own. And I would love to be in conversation with more where we're just not just saying, well, is it a racist system that goes after certain people? Like, yes.
Yeah, I don't think any of us.
But how are we culpable, right? Like sometimes it just gets put there rather than culpability of awareness. And I think that was important too, for the parents to be culpable, because their ignorance allows them not to be. And you can understand why, because that's how most things work. Like there are literally studies. If you surveyed most people in America, do they know the 3 branches of government? Do they know the Constitution? Do they know anything that they should know? Because it's not taught, because it's not encouraged, because it hasn't necessarily, to their minds, affected them, even though, like Miriam Kaba says, all of us are affected by prison and all that stuff, because we pay taxes that go into them.
Absolutely.
We may know people, All these elements are reasons we are connected to it on a daily basis. It might be in our neighborhood. It's in my neighborhood. There's a holding center, literally. I go out,
People be
walk 2.5
surprised.
blocks there.
Jails
Yeah.
are often in small town backyards as well, proliferating in small towns. So even when people think, well, I'm not in a city, I don't deal with that kind of crime or whatever.
No, they're there.
It's everywhere. And I think
There.
one of the things in your book that also struck me was sort of like, who is making the decisions? You get a sense in here. It's like there's a protocol laid out and everybody follows the rules, and there's no questioning it. And I think that also, I think what novels do for me anyway, is put me in the space of thinking more deeply from that emotional stance. But I don't read this book and think this is an indictment on a racist system. I mean, it's not hitting you over the head. It's not overly politicized, though it's in there and it's clear. I think there's also so many layers of our own role, that this could happen to anybody. One night in your life could change, and then boom, you're there. You know, and you never would have imagined. That has nothing to do with me, and all of a sudden it's the center of your life, right?
Right.
I think it does all of that so well, and I think it brings, it takes a kind of trajectory that we've seen, like you're saying, Scared Straight, or these. Actually, I think Orange is the New Black did a pretty accurate job. I mean, it was sensationalized, but of depicting women's prison. But I think you really bring readers into the sense of, all different kinds of people are affected by the system. It's right at your doorstep. You don't know. Right? And I know we have to go to questions soon. So I wanted to also talk about what kind of considerations were you thinking in writing this for young people? Because there's a question of a suicide in the book that I thought was, painful and real. And, the book is not shy to go into areas that are provocative: sexual pressures, drug use, suicide and self-harm, certainly the whole apparatus of the system here. How were you thinking about how teens digest and what they could handle? That's kind of not exactly how I want to phrase it, but I'm going to go with it and hope you know what I'm getting at.
No, that's fair. That's more than fair. I was in this conversation with Alex Gino and Mike Jung, and they write for a slightly younger audience, so middle grade, which is kind of like that junior high age. So it's like 10, 11, 12, 13, like even 9 years old, perhaps. And they're like, my book could be the book where they're first learning about something that could be really like hard and harmful. And that really hit me. And this was, I think, right before or after I sold the book, meaning like I hadn't, like it was finished, but it needed to be revised and all that stuff, right? And I was like, oh, I was like, am I perpetuating this, to your point, sensationalized thing that I do think people gravitate to when it comes to people of color or marginalized communities, that there is a level of violence, and I will name it as violence because sometimes it just is, right? And it's not necessarily needed for plot or movement of story. And sometimes it's just there. And sometimes it is really utilized in a way to tell a bigger story that may be more in your face and not as subtle or what have you. And so I had to really think about that, because like with the scene with consent, it was really important for me that consent happened. Like we already had Petra, who was dealing with, I don't need to repeat, you know what I mean? Like, do I need to repeat these things with these kids? Everybody is an individual. And if they're all bringing their own levels of big issues, I don't need to repeat them with somebody else. And you can feel Petra, like Petra is dealing with so much and it's shown on her body.
Yes.
I don't necessarily need to do that. And I never intended to do that with Violetta. And I just never saw Pascal as someone who would take something from her in that way. Like I wanted him to notice that she was uncomfortable. I wanted him to stop. That doesn't mean he's a great guy, right? Like testimony to what happens, but I didn't want him to just take it. You know what I mean? I didn't want him to be that guy who's taking what he wants, because she's already going through so much. And sometimes I think as artists, sometimes we can pile on, especially on the first page,
Ooh,
because you think it's like, oh, I'm being attention grabbing, and it's like, you're just freaking me out, you know, like there's just like that there, because it's like you want someone to stay, but then you go so high, where do you build as the story progresses if you start up here? So
and
you
also the
kind of have to
nuance
start
allowed.
here. Right. Like there needs to be kind of like, you could start not here, like you could start here and do that arc that we know happens eventually in storytelling. And trust yourself to do that, like just with
Mhm.
the emotion rather than everything being chaotic and awful and bad. So I thought about that a lot when it came to the characters. Like you see with Serena, the burn tips, like you don't need to go with Serena to see that. You're going with Violetta to see it. And you're understanding like all these different things. Like just the hearing of something can be scary enough. Like sometimes that's the best horror movie, is like
Yeah.
you hear it, you hear someone screaming off screen, but you're not seeing them be bludgeoned, and that can be terrifying. So it's like thinking
Yeah.
about those kind of things too, and the reader, because at the end of the day, a reader might be like, I need to put this down because this is too heavy, and I respect that. But if I know I can prevent that and navigate storytelling in a way that allows you to connect with character and see the rough stuff, I think that's a challenge I want to take as a writer, rather than being like, dead bodies. You know?
Yeah.
Like even Viv's
Yes.
dead body, like in an earlier draft, you saw her body, you saw her dead
Wow.
body, like the blood, and I took it out because I was
Mm.
like, it's gratuitous. Like the
Mm.
loss of her is enough. Is that how we want to see her, or do we want to see her through these memories and more alive? So those things like get extracted, because you're like, I don't need you to, like someone under a sheet, that's enough, right? So
That's enough.
yeah,
Absolutely. Someone under a sheet and saying what just happened there. I
right.
think also the loveliness of these characters, they are struggling with things, but they're kids. Like it comes through. Like there's a certain innocence, naivete to them, even as they're grappling through very adult things. They have very big hearts, clearly. They
Yeah.
love each other. And I think that that's what makes this book so readable, is that it's not that there's levity. There is levity, there's humor in it. Vin's very funny
Mm-hmm.
often too. But it's sort of their like innate youthfulness really shines through. You know, they don't stay in the system long enough to get so hardened to become these, overgrown, undergrown adults. They
Yeah. I mean, Eve
preserve.
is teetering.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean the main characters. I mean our Vin and Violetta. And I I felt very held in that. And I can imagine a young person feeling kind of held in that too. And I think sometimes we underestimate what young people can handle, like and I'm actually curious before we shift to Q&A. I actually have two questions left, but one is, have you gotten to hear any young people's responses to this, and what have some of them been?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing you want, is the young people, and that takes a while because schools need to adopt it. And the book came out in August. So I
Okay,
did meet teens thanks to Word Up Books, Word Up
nice.
Books Communicaria, which is one of my fave bookstores, and they're
Uptown.
in, yep, Washington Heights. And support them. They're more than a bookstore. They really are a community space, y'all. And Veronica and everybody, it's just so great. And I met a teen who had read it for their book club, and he's like, I love Callie. And I was just so taken because I was expecting him to say Vince or something like that. And he's like, no, I love Callie. And I was like, oh. And then I met teens a couple weeks ago at the Center for Fiction, and she's like, I love Vince. Like, I love Vince. And one person was just like, well, she did wrong, and da 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 da. And these kids, and so kids who had really, really finite understandings of that the system isn't okay. And it's fine that they didn't have answers, because I didn't want them to, but they understood that it's like, yeah, something's wrong with the system that doesn't allow room for a gray area. And
I
that
would
was heartening.
I
That
would
was really heartening.
I
Yeah.
look forward to, down the line hearing about how more young people respond to this. I'm thinking like young people who don't have a connection to the system and young people who do. I just have so many. I'll be so curious to talk to you down the line and find
Yeah.
what else has come up and come out from their engagement with this book. And I'm curious just on a personal level, you know, I'm shifting out of a decade of life deeply ensconced in this world of prison and prison work, and recently left a full-time job to pursue my own art, you know, and I know you for years have been really community oriented. You know, as an editor, as a podcast host, your name, obviously you won an award for it, but your name is always on people's tongues in community about how you've been helpful,
that's very
what you
kind
do
of
for
you.
others. It's
Oh.
just true. And I want to know, I selfishly want to know a little bit about this shift from sort of being the support of other writers, putting their work forward, into taking your own stage. How does it feel? Your
still
book.
look-
It's your book. It's not edited by. It's written by, because it's your book.
It is different. It is different from like everyday people and going on that tour and being like the mom and just being a perpetual moderator, which I was very happy to be. So it's very interesting because even the conversations with folks, people are like, so craft, and I'm just like, so yeah, I just write patches. Like you kind of want to come at it in a very like intellectual and kind of formal way, and it's like, yeah, it took years. I wrote in patches. The characters came to me. I'm in a zone. So sometimes I don't feel as articulate when I'm talking about the book. Like when I talk about the book, yeah. But then when I talk about craft and stuff like that. And also,
Yeah,
I like.
I don't know. I just muscled my way through it.
Yeah, I just did it, and then I got to do it again and again, and I'm under contract. And But I still like to talk more about other people. Even in conversation, I just want us to like continue to talk about this as people. So it is always maybe it's the podcaster in me, because everything needs to be a conversation rather than like, Jen, your book, and then so it's weird. It's a little weird because it's like, yeah, talk about the book, but then I'm like, nah, I still want to be in like a real conversation. I don't necessarily want it to be me. I want it to be us.
Yeah. Did you have to push yourself to get into a space where you were like, okay, now it's my book's turn? Or you were just like, it's always happening?
I think on the back end, it's very much like that. You know, when you're planning and you're doing stuff and you're working with your publisher, and then your publisher kind of moves on because, you know, the campaign ends theoretically. I use air quotes a lot, y'all. And then you're still working, like, you know, like you're still pushing that button. So from that end, like that admin, that pitching, that the working with an assistant to like get me out there, the book out there, yes. But then once you're in a public space, it's just still like, I like connecting with people. So even talking to like 50 teens at the Center for Fiction, I was like, can we get small groups? Can we do these things? And they're like, we don't necessarily have the capacity for the time we have, which is understandable, but you realize your comfort zones. My comfort zone is not being like on this big stage as a lecturer. I like being able to talk to everybody in small groups so that I can actually listen to people. And so I have to work on that because I'm supposed to talk to 100 teens next year.
So I think there's an interesting way to think about how do you work in both, which is something we can talk about offline. But I'm always really interested in facilitation too, and I have no problem talking about myself and being on stage, by the way. But I also really like to hear people's stories. So I think there's a way that, you know, we can think creatively, especially with young people when projects come out. So anyway, if you ever want to kiki about that offline,
sure, I'd love to.
I would have fun talking about that.
I'd love your brilliance and expertise in that, because I like small groups. You
can do a lot with big groups, Jen. You can have partner shares, you can ask a couple questions, you can do a writing prompt. There's a lot. We can talk about it all. And I used to do assemblies for students and bring people like Jason Reynolds came and burned the house down. They were
he always
obsessed. But I also borrowed a lot of tactics from those folks that I would see how masterfully they engaged, particularly teenagers, and particularly teenagers who maybe didn't care about reading all that much. And then all of a sudden, oh, wait a sec. I'm interested in reading a book, maybe for the first time ever, and what really helps them. So I'm happy to share all of that. I don't know if anybody is a facilitator on this call, so I don't want to go.
I welcome the support. But it's like,
Oh.
I'm gonna work with kids, and we're like, oh my God, there are 100 of them.
It's intimidating, and they're like, who are you? And teenagers are a tough crowd,
Yeah,
but
like gotta be here.
they're kind of like, in the trial orientation in the book. You got the one person taking notes and a bunch of people going, yeah. Years of it, girl. Had years of it. What's next for you? What are you working on now? Are you working on something? Are you going to stay in young adult? What's the trajectory?
I mean, I always tell people, and maybe I shouldn't, but like contractually.
Well, that matters.
I technically owe another young adult book, and I do have ideas, because and my agent is wonderful, because she's like, no, we think you should stay in the YA space. But I also am like, I look at a Jackie Woodson, because she writes for everybody,
She's
and
a
I
great
always kind of
model.
considered myself like that, where it's like the idea fits. Like, this idea wouldn't have fit adults for me. It had to be teenagers, and then another idea, it will have to be teenagers, but then another idea, it will have to be adults. So 2 things I'm working on right now are adults, and then I'm like crawling with this new YA book, because the character just didn't come to me in the way that she is kind of there, but like Violet and Vincent were just literally like in my house. So it's so much harder when you're like, I'm getting to know you versus I know you. And I just need to figure out this story, how the story works around who you are. And I know the story, but all this stuff.
Yeah, every project has their own personality, doesn't it?
Really does. It really does. Judith has several burning questions.
I just saw that pop up on the screen. And Judith, I'm not paying attention at all to questions.
Yes, I can ask it. I was trying to be polite and not start the space, but it's wide open. Hopefully I can be concise, but essentially I was so intrigued by hearing you say that you hired like 7, was it? Sensitivity or authenticity readers. And I'm curious about like if you assigned each person to look out for a specific thing, or were they looking at things overall? I haven't heard of someone asking so many people, but I'm also not, I could be wrong that that's very common. So I'm curious about what you were hoping that they would look at for you.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think it's a little bit more common for writing for young readers than adult, but I do know folks in the adult space who have done it, who've hired people. And I think mostly people do it now, but some folks don't. So for me, it was like definitely folks for the criminal justice element. That was number 1. Those were the folks I was like looking for, hiring. Queerness, Chinese, being Chinese, like, because I'm not Chinese. I mean, Black people read it too. I'm Black, but it doesn't mean Black people can't read it. Non-binary, because there's a non-binary character. Yeah, so it was queerness, Asian representation, non-binary representation, and then criminal justice too. And then folks may have found other stuff, like a friend who's like Vietnamese found stuff in the, they're not Chinese, but they're like, hey, having Chinese friends, I also noticed this, and my friend who's Chinese also noticed other things, she noticed like, she was the one who really pointed to the parents, like I was struggling with them, and she, she was looking for a rep, but as a reader, she's just like, these things, and she pointed to them. She was like highlighting lines, which is really helpful. That's how I operate as an editor too. I'm like, I'm pointing to this paragraph that is not working for these reasons. And so folks, if they found other things, like Vince was a senior at first, and then people were like, nah, he got to be a junior. Like, he got to be a junior the way you're working with the story. I had him do 2 sports at the same time, and they're like, he can't do 2 sports at the same time. And this person was just like, because they tutored. They're like, I'm telling you, they can't do 2 sports at the same time. It's too much in high school. So all those things that people were like, and parents, people who are parents read it, were like, nope, I have kids, and so all that stuff. Because sometimes it's just like like my agent is a parent and white, my editor is not a parent and Black. And so you're in this kind of space where it might be very cis, might be very het, might be very femme, and you got to get those other those other representations and just understand them. Even though I knew the characters, I'm like, yeah, but I could be missing something.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
I'm gonna find a way to push myself into your life and ask you when we have time all of these other questions because this is amazing.
Oh, thank
And
you. You've
I'm
been so
yeah.
kind. Thank you.
No, it's not even kindness, it's facts. And like Caits mentioned, it's so exciting. Again, Jenn has been a shepherd and supporter of so many artists over the years. And so as soon as I saw that she had a book coming out, I was like, okay. And same with Aaron, our executive director.
Oh
And
yeah, Aaron.
yes, shout out. So it sounds amazing. That is our time for this event.
Can
Caits,
I just apologize that in my mind, we were going to 8:30, but it's 6:30 to 8. So I was like, we have all this time for questions. And then I just realized right now,
let
oh,
me make sure
and-
I'm not looking at it wrong.
no, you're
You're
not.
both right.
Okay.
I was
You're
and
both
also
right.
just really enjoying talking to Jenn. So I apologize.
No, I
Like,
would have done a
much
time check if I were like, no, I don't want to hear, but I wanted to hear all of it. This could be so it was also self-indulgent for me. Thank you everyone who joined for tonight.
Thank
For those
you.
of you who may not be able to join again, there's a chance we'll have a recording. Stay tuned. We'll see. Thank you so much, Caits, for bringing your own expertise and passion and concern, not only about this
And
issue,
this
but about
beautiful
writing
book.
more generally. There is Caits's book. I'm going to follow up with our attendees so that you can have all the links once more. Thank you so much to Jenn again for taking time out. This is a busy time of year. This is a busy year for you in general, I'm sure. We massively appreciate it. Congrats on the new book. And I'm just gonna I'll pop in the event page for tonight again. But if you want to see more of what we're up to, you can go to NewYorkWritersCoalition.org and poke around. It's the end of the year, so we're wrapping up our public programs. But if you sign up for our newsletter, which you can also find on the site, you'll learn about our upcoming program for the Black Writers Program. We've already started plotting out some of what we're doing. We have some amazing programming and events coming up in mind. We have some amazing public programs more generally. Our outreach workshops, we will be relaunching again next year. So lots of great stuff. Stay in the loop. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Caits and Jenn.
Thank you, Caits and
Thank
Judith.
you,
Thank you, everybody, so much for being here.